The lovers. Oh gosh, is that the time? Sorry, I have to go, the man mumbled evasively, as he stood up and reached for his bag. The woman said. She glared with uncertainty. She hadn't heard him say it was over, but he had called her his girlfriend of 3 years to come out for a serious conversation, and now he had suddenly announced he was going to work in America. He was to leave immediately in a few hours. Even without hearing those words, she knew now that the serious conversation was about breaking up. She knew now it was a mistake to have hoped that the serious conversation might have included, "Will you marry me?" For example. What? The man responded dryly. He didn't make eye contact with her. "Don't I deserve an explanation?" she asked. The woman spoke using an interrogative tone the man particularly disliked. They were in a windowless basement cafe. The lighting was provided by just 6 shaded lamps hanging from the ceiling and a single wall lamp near the entrance. A permanent sepia hue stained the cafe interior. Without a clock, there was no way to tell night and day. There were 3 large antique wall clocks in the cafe. The arms of each, however, showed different times. Was this intentional, or were they just broken? Customers on their first visit never understood why they were like this. Their only option was to check their watches. The man did likewise. While looking at the time on his watch, he started rubbing his fingers above his right eyebrow, while his lower lip began to protrude slightly. The woman found that expression particularly exasperating. "And why are you looking like that? Like I'm the one being a pain?" she blurted out. "I'm not thinking that," he replied sheepishly. "Yes, you are," she insisted, with bottom lip again protruding. He evaded her stare and offered no reply. The man's passive behavior was infuriating the woman more and more. She scowled. "You want it to be me who says it." She reached for her coffee, from which all heat had now gone. With the sweetest part of the experience lost, it sent her mood plummeting further. The man looked at his watch again and counted back from the boarding time. He had to leave the cafe very soon. Unable to compose himself any better, his fingers had found their way back to his eyebrow. The sight of him so obviously hung up about the time annoyed her. She recklessly plunked the cup down on the table. It came down hard on the saucer. Clang! The loud noise startled him. His fingers, which had been busy caressing his right eyebrow, began to pull at his hair. But then, after taking a short deep breath, he sat back down and looked her in the face. All of a sudden, his face was calm. In fact, the man's face had so clearly changed that the woman was quite taken aback. She looked down and stared at her hands clenched on her lap. The man, who had worried about time, didn't wait for the woman to look up. "Now, look," he started, no longer muttering. He sounded collected and together, but as if she was actively trying to stop short his next words, the woman said, "Why don't you just go?" She didn't look up. The woman, who wanted an explanation, now refused to hear it. The man sat motionless, as if time itself had stopped. "It's time for you to go, isn't it?" she said, as petulantly as a child. He looked at her perplexed, as if he didn't understand what she meant, as if she was aware of how childish and unpleasant she sounded. She uncomfortably averted her eyes from the man and bit her lip. He rose from his seat and spoke to the waitress standing behind the counter. "Excuse me, I'd like to pay," he said in a small voice. The man tried to grab the bill, but the woman's hand was pressing down on it. "I'm going to stay a bit longer, so I'll pay," was what she meant to say, but he had pulled out the bill from under her hand with ease and was walking to the cash register. "Together, thanks." "Oh," I said, "leave it," not moving from her chair. The woman reached out her hand to the man, but the man refused to look at her. He pulled out a 1,000 yen note from his wallet. "Keep the change," he said as he handed the waitress the note together with the bill. The man turned, his face filled with sadness, to the woman for a split second as he picked up his bag and left. Clang dong. "And that happened 1 week ago," said Fumiko Kiyokawa. Her upper body flopped into a heap on the table like a deflating balloon. As she collapsed, she somehow avoided spilling the coffee cup in front of her. The waitress and the customer seated at the counter, who had been listening to Fumiko's story, to each other. Before Fumiko had finished senior high school, She had already mastered 6 languages. After graduating top of her class from Waseda University, she joined a major medical-related firm in Tokyo. By her second year at the firm, she was already directing numerous projects. She was the epitome of the smart, career-driven woman. Today, Fumiko was dressed in ordinary business attire, a white blouse and black skirt and jacket. Judging by her appearance, she was on her way home from work. Fumiko's looks were better than ordinary. Blessed with well-defined features and petite lips, she had the face of a pop idol. Her mid-length black hair shone and crowned her with a glowing halo. Despite her conservative clothes, her exceptional figure was easy to discern. Like a model from a fashion magazine, she was a beautiful woman who would draw anyone's gaze. Yes, she was a woman who combined intelligence and beauty. But whether she realized this was a different matter. In the past, Fumiko hadn't been one to dwell on such things. She had lived only for her work. Of course, this didn't mean she had never had relationships. It's just that they never had the same allure for her as work. "My work is my lover," she would say. She had turned down approaches from many men, as though flicking away specks of dust. The man she had been talking about was Goro Kotara. Goro was a systems engineer. Unlike Fumiko, he was employed by a medical company, though it wasn't a major one. He was her boyfriend. He was her boyfriend and 3 years her junior. They had met 2 years ago via a client for which they were both doing a project. 1 week ago, Goro had asked Fumiko to meet for a serious conversation. She had arrived at the meeting place in an elegant pale pink dress with a beige spring coat and white pumps, having caught the attention of all the men she had passed on the way there. It was a new look for Fumiko. She was such a workaholic that, before her relationship with Goro, she had owned no other clothes but suits. Suits were what she had worn on dates with Goro as well. After all, they mostly met after work. Goro had said serious conversation, and Fumiko had interpreted this as meaning that the conversation was going to be special. So, filled with expectation, she had bought an outfit especially. They arrived at their chosen cafe to find a sign on the window saying it was closed due to unforeseen circumstances. Fumiko and Goro were disappointed. The cafe would have been ideal for a serious conversation, as each table was in a private booth. Left with no choice but to find another suitable place, they noticed a small sign down a quiet side street. As it was a basement cafe, they had no way of knowing what it was like inside, but Fumiko was attracted by its name, which came from the lyrics of a song she used to sing as a child, and they agreed to go in. Fumiko regretted her decision as soon as she peered inside. It was smaller than she had imagined. The cafe had counter and table seats, but with just 3 seats at the counter and 3 two-seater tables. It only took 9 customers to fill the place. Unless the serious conversation currently weighing on Fumiko's mind was to be held in whispers, the entire thing would be overheard. Another negative was the way that everything appeared as in sepia, owing to the few shaded lamps. It was not to her taste at all. A place for shady deals, that was Fumiko's first impression of this cafe. She nervously made her way to the only empty table and sat down. There were 3 other customers and 1 waitress in the cafe. At the furthest table sat a woman in a white short-sleeved dress, quietly reading a book. At the table closest to the entrance sat a dull-looking man. A travel magazine was spread open on the table, and he was jotting memos in a tiny notebook. The woman seated at the counter wore a bright red camisole and green leggings. A sleeveless kimono jacket hung on the back of her chair, and she still had curlers in her hair. She glanced fleetingly at Fumiko, grinning broadly as she did. At several points during Fumiko and Goro's conversation, the woman made a remark to the waitress and let off a raucous laugh. On hearing Fumiko's explanation, the woman in curlers said, "I see." Actually, she didn't see at all. She was just following up with the appropriate response. Her name was Yako Hirai, one of the cafe regulars. She had just turned 30 and ran a nearby snack or hostess bar. She always came in for a cup of coffee before work. Her curlers were in again, but today she was wearing a revealing yellow tube top, a bright red miniskirt and vivid purple leggings. Hirai was sitting cross-legged on the counter chair while listening to Fumiko. It was 1 week ago. You remember, don't you? Fumiko stood up and directed her attention across the counter to the waitress. Yeah, the waitress answered uneasily, not looking at Fumiko's face. The waitress's name was Kozu Tokita. Kozu was a cousin of the proprietor. She was waitressing there while attending Tokyo University of the Arts. She had quite a pretty face, a pale complexion, and narrow almond-shaped eyes, yet her features were not memorable. It was the type of face that if you glanced at it, closed your eyes, and then tried to remember what you saw, nothing would come to mind. In a word, she was inconspicuous. She had no presence. She didn't have many friends either. Not that she worried about it. Kozu was the sort of person who found interpersonal relationships rather tedious. So, what about him? Where is he now? Hirai asked, playing with the cup in her hand, not seeming very interested. America, Fumiko said, puffing out her cheeks. So your boyfriend chose work, then? Hirai had a gift for getting to the heart of the matter. No, that's not right. Fumiko protested. But that is right, isn't it? He went to America, didn't he? Hirai said. She was having a hard time understanding Fumiko. Didn't you understand when I explained? Fumiko said vehemently. What bit? I wanted to scream out don't go, but I was too proud. Not many women would admit that. Hirai leant back with a snicker, slipped off balance, and nearly fell off the chair. Fumiko ignored Hirari's reaction. You understood, right? She said, looking for support from Kozu. Kozu feigned a moment's contemplation. Basically you're saying you didn't want him to go to America, right? Kozu was also one to get straight to the point. Well, basically, I guess. No, I didn't. But, you're a difficult one to understand, Hirari said jovially, after seeing that Fumiko was struggling to reply. If Hirari had been in Fumiko's place, she would have just broken down in tears. Don't go, she would have screamed. Of course, they would have been crocodile tears. Tears are a woman's weapon. That was Hirari's philosophy. Fumiko turned to Kozu at the middle of the counter. Her eyes were glistening. Anyway, I want you to transport me back to that day. That day 1 week ago, she pleaded, totally straight-faced. Hirai was first to respond to the lunacy of requesting to be sent back to 1 week ago. Back in time, she says. She looked at Kozu with raised eyebrows. Looking uncomfortable, Kozu simply muttered, oh, and didn't add anything further. Several years had passed since the cafe had its moment of fame, the light of an urban legend that claimed it could transport people back to the past. Uninterested in that kind of thing, Fumiko had allowed it to fade from her memory. Visiting a week ago was complete happenstance, but last night she had watched a variety program on TV. In the introduction, the host spoke about urban legends, and like a bolt of lightning striking inside her head, she remembered the cafe. The cafe that transports you back in time. It was an incomplete memory, but she remembered that key phrase clearly. If I return to the past, I might be able to set things right. I might be able to have a conversation with Goro once more. She replayed this fanciful wish over and over in her mind. She became obsessed and lost any ability to make a level-headed judgment. The next morning she went to work, completely forgetting to eat breakfast. There, her mind was not on the job. She sat there, obsessed with the passing time. I just want to make sure. She wanted to find out either way as soon as possible, and not a second later. Her day at work was a long string of careless mistakes. So sporadic was her attention that a colleague asked if she was okay. By the end of the day, she had reached peak scatterbrain. It took her 30 minutes to get from her company to the cafe by train. She pretty much ran the last stretch from the station. Entering the cafe, feeling quite breathless, she'd walked up to Kozu. Please send me back to the past. She'd pleaded before Kozu could even finish saying, hello, welcome. Her animated gestures had continued in that vein until she had finished her explanation. But now, looking at the reaction of the two women, she felt ill at ease. Hirari just continued to stare at her with a large smirk on her face, while Kozu wore a deadpan expression and avoided all eye contact. If it was true about going back in time, I guess the place would be thronging with people, Fumiko thought to herself, but the only people in this cafe were the woman in the white dress, the man with his travel magazine, and Hirai and Kozu, the same faces that were here a week ago. It's possible to go back, right? She asked, uneasily. It may have been prudent to begin with this question, but it was pointless to realize this now. Well, is it or not? She asked, staring directly at Kozu on the other side of the counter. Kozu replied. Fumiko's eyes once again lit up. She was not hearing a no. An air of excitement started to surround her. Please send me back. She pleaded so energetically that she seemed about to leap over the counter. You want to go back and do what? Asked Hirai coolly, between sips of her tepid coffee. I'd make amends. Her face was serious. I see, said Hirai with a shrug. Please. She spoke louder, the word reverberated throughout the cafe. It was only recently that the idea of marrying Goro had occurred to her. She was turning 28 this year, and she had been interrogated on many occasions by her persistent parents, who lived in Hakodate. Still not thinking of marriage. Haven't you met any nice men? And so forth. Her parents' nagging had grown more intense since her 25-year-old sister got married the year before. Now it had reached the point where she was receiving weekly emails. Aside from her younger sister, Fumiko also had a 23-year-old brother. He had married a girl from their hometown, following a surprise pregnancy, leaving only Fumiko single. Fumiko felt no rush, but after her little sister got married, her mindset had changed just a little. She had started to think getting married might be okay, if it was to Goro. Hirai plucked a cigarette from her leopard print pouch. Perhaps you'd best explain it to her properly, said, in a businesslike manner, while lighting it. Don't you think? It seems like I should, Kozu replied in her toneless voice as she walked around the counter and stood before Fumiko. She looked at her with a soft kindness in her eyes, as if she were consoling a crying child. Look, I want you to listen, and listen carefully. Okay, what? Fumiko's body tensed up. You can go back. It's true. You can go back. But, when you go back, no matter how hard you try, the present won't change. The present won't change. This was something Fumiko was totally unprepared for, something she couldn't take in. She said loudly without thinking. Kozu calmly continued explaining. Even if you go back to the past and tell your boyfriend who went to America how you feel, even if I tell him how I feel, the present won't change. What? Not wanting to hear. Fumiko desperately covered her ears, but Kozu casually went on to say the words that she least wanted to hear. It won't change the fact that he's gone to America. A trembling sensation swept through her entire body, yet with what seemed like a ruthless disregard for her feelings, Kozu continued with her explanation. Even if you return to the past, reveal your feelings, and ask him not to go, it won't change the present. Fumiko reacted impulsively to Kozu's cold hard words. That sort of defeats the purpose, don't you think? She said defiantly. Easy now. Let's not shoot the messenger, Hirai said. She took a drag of her cigarette and seemed unsurprised by Fumiko's reaction. Why? Fumiko asked Kozu, her eyes begging for answers. Why? I'll tell you why, Kozu began. Because that's the rule. There tends to be, in any movie or novel about time travel, some rule saying, don't go meddling in anything that is going to change the present. For example, going back and preventing your parents marrying or meeting would erase the circumstances of your birth and cause your present self to vanish. This had been the standard state of affairs in most time travel stories that Fumiko knew, so she believed in the rule. If you change the past, you do change the present. On that basis, she wanted to return to the past and have the chance to do it afresh. Alas, it was a dream that was not to be. She wanted a convincing explanation as to why this unbelievable rule existed, that there is nothing you can do while in the past that will change the present. The only explanation that Kozu would give was to say, because that's the rule. Was she trying to tease her in a friendly way by not telling her the reason? Or was it a difficult concept that she was unable to explain? Or perhaps She didn't understand the reason either, as her casual expression seemed to suggest. Hirari seemed to be relishing the sight of Fumiko's expression. "Tough luck," she said, exhaling a plume of smoke with obvious pleasure. She had drafted that line earlier when Fumiko had begun her explanation, and had been waiting to deliver it ever since. But why? Fumiko felt the energy drain from her body. As she let herself slouch limply into her chair, a vivid recollection came to her. She had read an article on this cafe in a magazine. The article had the headline "Uncovering Truth Behind Time-Traveling Cafe, Famous by Urban Legend." The gist of the article was as follows. The cafe's name was Funiculi Funicula. It had become famous, with long queues each day, on account of the time traveling, but it wasn't possible to find anyone who had actually gone back in time, because of the extremely annoying rules that had to be followed. The first rule was, the only people you can meet while in the past are those who have visited the cafe. This would usually defeat the purpose of going back. Another rule was, there is nothing you can do while in the past that will change the present. The cafe was asked why that rule existed, but their only comment was that they didn't know, as the author of the article was unable to find anyone who had actually visited the past. Whether or not it was actually possible to go back in time remained a mystery. Even supposing it was possible, the sticky point of not being able to change the present certainly made the whole idea seem pointless. The article concluded by stating that it certainly made an interesting urban legend, but it was difficult to see why the legend existed. As a postscript, the article also mentioned there were apparently other rules that had to be followed, but it was unclear what they were. Fumiko's attention returned to the cafe. Hirari seated herself opposite her, at the table she had collapsed onto, and proceeded to merrily explain the other rules. With her head and shoulders still sprawled on the table, Fumiko fixed her eyes on the sugar pot, wondering why the cafe didn't use sugar cubes, and quietly listened. "It's not just those rules. There's only one seat that allows you to go back in time, okay? And, while in the past, you can't move from that seat," Hirari said. "What else was there?" she asked Kozu, as she moved her count to her fifth finger. "There's a time limit," Kozu said, keeping her eyes on the glass she was wiping. She mentioned it like an afterthought, as if she were merely talking to herself. Fumiko raised her head in reaction to this news. "A time limit." Kozu showed a slight smile and nodded. Hirari gave the table a nudge. "Frankly, after hearing just these rules, barely anyone still wants to return to the past," she said, apparently enjoying herself. And she was indeed taking great delight in observing Fumiko. "It's been a long time since we've seen a customer like you. Someone totally set in your delusion of wanting to go back to the past." "Hirari," Kozu said sternly, "life doesn't get served to you on a plate. Why don't you just give it up?" Hirari blurted out. She looked ready to continue her tirade. "Hirari," Kozu repeated, this time with a bit more emphasis. No, I think it's best to clearly put it out there." "Huh." Then Hirari guffawed loudly. The words spoken were all too much for Fumiko. Her strength had entirely drained from her body, and again she collapsed head and shoulders onto the table. Then, from across the room, "Can I have a refill, please?" said the man sitting at the table closest to the entrance with his travel magazine and out in front of him. "Okay," Kozu called back. Klangdong, a woman, had entered the cafe alone. She was wearing a beige cardigan over a pale aqua shirt dress and crimson trainers, and carrying a white canvas bag. Her eyes were round and sparkling like a little girl's. "Hello." Kozu's voice boomed through the cafe. "Hi, Kozu." "Sis." "Hi there." Kozu called her sis, but actually she was her cousin's wife, Kato Kita. "Looks like the cherry blossoms have had it." Kay smiled, showing no grief at their passing. "Yes, the trees are pretty bare now." Kozu's tone was polite, but not the same polite, civil tone she had used when speaking to Fumiko. Her tone now sounded softer and more like a dove. "Good evening," said Hirari as she moved from the seat at Fumiko's table to the counter, appearing to be no longer interested in laughing at Fumiko's misfortune. "Where have you been?" "Hospital." "What for?" Just a routine checkup. Yes, you've got a bit of color in your face today. Yes, I feel good. Glancing over at Fumiko still limp at the table, Kei tilted her head inquisitively. Hirari gave a slight nod, and with that, Kei disappeared into the room behind the counter. Clangdong soon after Kei had disappeared into the back room. A large man poked his head through the doorway, bowing his head to stop it banging into the door frame. He was wearing a light jacket over his chef's uniform of white shirt and black trousers. A huge bundle of keys was jingling in his right hand. He was Nogari Tokita, the owner of the cafe. Good evening, Kozu greeted him. Nogari nodded in response and turned his eyes to the man with the magazine at the table closest to the entrance. Kozu went into the kitchen to bring a refill for the empty coffee cup that Hirari was silently holding up, while Hirari, leaning with one elbow on the counter, quietly observed Nogari. Nogari was standing in front of the man who was engrossed in his magazine. Fusagi, he said gently. For a moment, the man called Fusagi didn't react, as if it hadn't registered that his name had been called. Then he looked up slowly at Nogari. Nogari nodded politely and said, "Hello." "Oh, hello," Fusagi said, with a blank expression. He immediately returned to his magazine. For a moment, Nogari continued to stand there looking at him. "Kozu," he called to the kitchen. Kozu poked her face out from the kitchen. "What is it?" "Rinko take for me, please." The request puzzled Kozu for a while. "Yes, because she's been looking," Nogari said, as he turned to face Fusagi. Kozu understood what he meant. "Oh, right," she replied. After giving Hirari a refill, she disappeared into the back room again to make the phone call. Nogari cast a sideways glance at Fumiko slumped over the table as he walked behind the counter and took a glass from the shelf. He pulled out a carton of orange juice from the fridge under the counter, poured it nonchalantly into the glass, and gulped it down. Nogari took the glass into the kitchen to wash it. A moment later, there was the sound of fingernails tapping on the counter. He poked his head out of the kitchen to see what was happening. Hirari made a small beckoning gesture. With dripping hands, he approached quietly. She leaned a little over the counter. "How was it?" she whispered to him as he searched for some kitchen paper. He mumbled, ambiguously. Maybe it was somehow an answer to the question. Or maybe it was just a frustrated grunt while looking for the elusive kitchen paper. Hirari lowered her voice further. "How were the test results?" Not replying to this question, Nogari briefly scratched the top of his nose. "They were bad," Hirari asked more somberly. Nogari's expression did not falter. "After looking at the results, they decided she doesn't need to be hospitalized," he explained in a low mumble, almost as if he was talking to himself. Hirari gave a quiet sigh. "I see," she said, and glanced towards the back room where Kei was. Kei was born with a weak heart. Throughout her life, she had been in and out of hospital. Nevertheless, having been blessed all her life with a friendly and carefree disposition, she could always manage a smile, no matter how bad her condition got. Hirari was all too familiar with that aspect of her. That was why she checked with Nogari. Nogari had finally located the kitchen paper and was wiping his hands. "And how are things with you, Hirari? Are they okay?" Hirari wasn't sure what Nogari was asking about. Her eyes widened. "What do you mean? Your sister has been coming to see you a fair bit, hasn't she?" "Ah, I guess she has," Hirari answered, while she looked around the cafe. "Your parents run a traveler's inn, right?" "Yeah, that's right." Nogari didn't know about things in much detail, but he had heard that, as a result of Hirari having left the family home, her sister had taken over running the inn. "It must be tough for your sister, alone like that." "No, she's coping all right. My sister's got the right head for handling that kind of work. But still, it's been too long. I can't go home now," Hirari snapped. She pulled out a large purse from her leopard skin pouch. It was so big, it looked more like a dictionary than a purse. Her purse jingled as she began foraging among the coins. "Why not? Even if I went home, I wouldn't be any help," she said, tilting her head with a silly smile. "But, anyway, thanks for the coffee. I have to go," she said, cutting Nogari short. She put the coffee money on the counter, then got up and walked out of the door, as if she was running away from the conversation. Clanged on while picking up the coins that Harari had left. Nogari glanced at Fumiko slumped on the table, but it was just a glance. He didn't seem very interested in who this woman was, face down on the table. He collected up the coins in his large hands and playfully jangled them. "Hey, bro." Kozu's face appeared as she called out. Kozu called Nogari bro despite him being her cousin, not her brother. "What? Sis is calling you." Nogari looked around the cafe. "Okay, coming," he said. He casually placed the coins in Kozu's hand. "Kotake said she comes straight away," Kozu said. Nogari received the news with a nod. "Look after the cafe, could you?" He disappeared into the back room. "Okay," she said. The only people in the cafe, though, were the woman reading a novel, Fumiko, who was slumped over the table, and Fusagi, who was taking notes from the magazine spread open on the table. After depositing the coins in the cash register, Kozu cleared away the coffee cup left by Harari. One of the cafe's 3 old wall clocks sounded 5 deep resonating gongs. "Coffee, please," Fusagi called over to Kozu behind the counter, holding up his coffee cup as he spoke. He had yet to receive the refill he had already asked for. "Oh, right," exclaimed Kozu, realizing, and hurried back to the kitchen. She came out again holding a transparent glass carafe filled with coffee. "Even that would be okay," muttered Fumiko, still slumped on the table. While Kozu was pouring a refill for Fusagi, Fumiko's presence in the corner of her vision attracted her attention. Fumiko sat upright. "Even that I can live with. It's okay if nothing changes. Things can stay as they are." She got up and went over to Kozu, invading her space a little, gently placing a coffee cup in front of Fusagi. Kozu's brow settled into a frown. She took a couple of steps back. "Right, she said. Fumiko drew in even closer. "So transport me to 1 week ago." It was as if her doubts had been washed away. No longer was there any hint of uncertainty in her speech. If anything, there was just excitement at the chance of returning to the past. Her nostrils were flaring with enthusiasm. But becoming uncomfortable with Fumiko's overbearing attitude, Kozu darted around her and moved back behind the counter as if seeking refuge. "One more important rule," she began. In response to these words, Fumiko's eyebrows widened considerably. "What? There are more rules. You can't meet people who haven't visited this cafe. The present cannot change. There is only one seat that takes you to the past, and you cannot move from it. Then, there is the time limit." Fumiko counted on her fingers as she ran through each rule, and her anger at them grew. This one is probably the most problematic. Fumiko was already extremely annoyed with the rules she knew. The news of a further, most problematic rule threatened to snap her heart in two. Nevertheless, she bit her lip. "If that's the case, then fine, so be it. Go on, tell me," she said, folding her arms and nodding to Kozu, as if to emphasize her resolve. Kozu drew a short breath as if to say, "Oh well then," and vanished into the kitchen to put away the transparent glass carafe she had been holding. Left standing there alone, Fumiko took a deep breath to feel more centered. Her initial aim had been to return to the past to somehow stop Goro going to America. Stopping him from going sounded bad, but if she confessed, "I don't want you to go," Goro might give up the idea of leaving. If things went well, they might end up never splitting up. At any rate, the initial reason for wanting to go back to the past was to change the present. But if it wasn't possible to change the present, then Goro going to America and them splitting up were also unchangeable. Regardless, Fumiko still yearned passionately to return to the past. All she wanted to do was to go back and see. Her entire objective was centered on the actual act of going back. Her heart was set on experiencing this fantastical phenomenon. She didn't know whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. It might be a good thing, and how could it be a bad thing? She told herself. After she finished a deep breath, Kozu returned. Fumiko's face stiffened, like an accused awaiting the court's decision. Kozu stood behind the counter. "It is only possible to go back in time when seated at a particular seat in this cafe," she proclaimed. Fumiko reacted instantly. Which one? Where should I sit? She looked around the cafe so rapidly she almost made a whooshing sound as she turned her head from side to side. Ignoring her reaction, Kozu turned her head and looked fixedly at the woman in the white dress. Fumiko followed her constant gaze. That seat, Kozu said quietly. That one. The one the woman's sitting in. Fumiko whispered across the counter, while keeping her eyes glued on the woman in the dress. Yes, Kozu answered simply. Yet even before she had finished hearing that short reply, Fumiko was already walking up to the woman in the white dress. She was a woman who gave the impression that fortune had passed her by. Her white, almost translucent skin contrasted starkly with her long black hair. It may have been spring, but the weather was definitely still chilly on bare skin. Yet the woman was wearing short sleeves, and there was no sign she had a jacket with her. Fumiko was getting the feeling that something was not right, but now was not the time to be concerned with such things. Fumiko spoke to the woman. Excuse me, would you mind awfully if we swap seats? She asked, holding back her impatience. She thought she had spoken politely and without rudeness, yet the woman in the dress did not react. It was as if she had not even heard her. Fumiko felt a little put out by this. On some rare occasions a person can be so engrossed in a book she does not hear the surrounding voices and sounds. Fumiko assumed that was the case here. She tried again. Hello, can you hear me? You're wasting your time. The voice came unexpectedly from behind Fumiko. It was Kozu. It took her a while to work out what she meant by it. I only wanted her to give me the seat. Why was I wasting my time? Was I wasting my time asking politely? Wait. Is this another rule? Do I have to clear this other rule first? If that's the case, I think she could say something a bit more helpful than you're wasting your time. Such were the thoughts that were running through her mind. Yet in the end, she asked a simple question. Why? She asked Kozu with a look of childlike innocence. Kozu looked directly into her eyes. Because that woman is a ghost, she responded sternly. She sounded deadly serious and like she was telling the absolute truth. Once again, Fumiko's head was filled with racing thoughts. Ghost. A real moaning, shrieking ghost. The sort that appears under a weeping willow in the summer. The girl just said it so casually, maybe I misheard. But what sounds like is a ghost. Fumiko's head was awash with many confusing thoughts. Ghost. Yes, you're messing with me. No, honestly, she's a ghost. Fumiko was bewildered. She was happy not to get stuck on questioning whether or not ghosts actually exist, but what she couldn't accept was the possibility that the woman in the dress was a ghost. She seemed far too real. Look, I can clearly see her. Kozu finished her sentence as if she knew what Fumiko was going to say. Fumiko was confused, but, without thinking, she stretched her hand out towards the woman's shoulder. Just as she was about to touch the woman in the dress, Kozu said, "You can touch her." Again, Kozu had a ready reply. Fumiko placed her hand on the woman's shoulder, as if to confirm that she could be touched. Without a doubt, she could feel the woman's shoulder and the material of the dress covering her soft skin. She couldn't believe that this was a ghost. She gently removed her hand. Then once again, she placed her hand on the woman's shoulder. She turned to Kozu as if to say, I can clearly touch her. Calling this person a ghost is crazy. But Kozu's face remained cool and composed. She's a ghost. Really? A ghost? Fumiko poked her head towards the woman and looked her squarely in the face, quite rudely. Yes, Kozu replied, with utmost certainty. No way. I just can't believe it. If Fumiko could see her, but was unable to touch her, then she could have accepted it. But this was not the case. She could touch the woman, who had legs. The title of the book the woman was reading was one she had never heard of. It was a normal book, nevertheless one that you could buy almost anywhere. This led Fumiko to come up with a theory. You can't really go back to the past. This cafe can't really take you back to the past. It is all just a ploy to get people to come. Take the countless number of annoying rules. For example, these are just the first hurdle to encourage customers wanting to return to the past to give up. If the customer passes that first hurdle, then this must be the second hurdle for those customers who still want to go back in time. They mention a ghost to frighten the person into giving up on the idea. The woman in the dress is just for show. She's pretending to be a ghost. Fumiko was beginning to feel quite stubborn. If it's all a lie, then so be it. But I'm not going to be fooled by this lie. Fumiko addressed the woman in the dress politely. Look, it will only be for a short while. Please would you kindly allow me to sit there? But it was as if her words hadn't reached the woman's ears. She continued reading without the slightest reaction. Being totally ignored like this darkened Fumiko's mood. She grabbed the woman's upper arm. Stop! You mustn't do that, warned Kozu loudly. Hey, just stop it. Stop just ignoring me. Fumiko tried to forcefully drag the woman in the dress from her seat. And then it happened, glared at her fiercely. The woman in the dress's eyes widened, and she felt as if the weight of her body had increased many times over. It felt as if dozens of heavy blankets had fallen over her. The light in the cafe dimmed to the brightness of candlelight. An unworldly wailing began to reverberate through the cafe. She was paralyzed. Unable to move a muscle, she dropped to her knees and then fell to a crawling position. Ew, what's happening? What's happening? She had absolutely no idea what was happening. Kozu, in a smug, told, "You so kind of way," simply said. She cursed you. When Fumiko heard curse, she didn't understand at first. Huh, she asked with a groan. Unable to withstand this invisible force that seemed to be getting stronger, Fumiko was now lying face down on the floor. What? What is this? What's going on? It's a curse. You went ahead and did what you did, and she cursed you, said Kozu as she slipped back into the kitchen, leaving Fumiko sprawled on the floor, lying face down. Fumiko didn't see Kozu go, but with one ear firmly against the floor, she clearly heard Kozu leave by the sound of her fading footsteps. Her fear was so intense, Fumiko shivered as if icy water had been poured over her entire body. You've got to be kidding. Look at me. What can I do? There was no response. Fumiko started shuddering. The woman in the dress was still glaring at Fumiko with a terrifying expression. She seemed a completely different person to the woman who had been calmly reading her book just moments earlier. Help me. Please help me. Fumiko yelled out to the kitchen. Kozu calmly returned. Fumiko could not see this, but Kozu was holding a glass carafe of coffee in her hand. Fumiko heard her footsteps coming towards her, but she had no idea what was happening. First the rules, then the ghost, and now the curse. It was all utterly bewildering. Kozu hadn't even given her any indication whether she meant to help her or not. Fumiko was on the verge of yelling help at the top of her lungs, but right at that moment, would you care for some more coffee? Fumiko heard Kozu asking nonchalantly. Fumiko was incensed, ignoring her in her moment of need. Kozu was not only not helping, she was offering the woman in the dress some more coffee. Fumiko was dumbfounded. I was clearly told that she was a ghost, and it was wrong of me not to believe it. It was also wrong of me to grab onto the woman's arm and try to forcefully remove her from her chair. But even though I've been yelling help me, the girl has just been ignoring me, and now she's breezily asking that woman if she wants more coffee. Why would a ghost be wanting another coffee? You've got to be kidding, was all that Fumiko was able to vocalize, however, but without hesitation. Yes, please, an eerily ethereal voice replied. It was the woman in the dress who had spoken. Suddenly, Fumiko's body felt lighter. The curse had been lifted. Fumiko, unencumbered and panting, stood upright on her knees and glared at Kozu. Kozu returned her gaze, as if to ask, "You have something to say?" and shrugged with indifference. The woman in the dress took a sip from her freshly poured coffee and then returned quietly to her book. Acting as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened, Kozu disappeared back to the kitchen to return the carafe. Fumiko once more reached her hand out to touch the shoulder of that terrifying woman in the dress. Her fingers could feel her. The woman is here. She exists. Unable to understand such weird events, Fumiko was completely confused. She had experienced the whole thing. She couldn't dispute that. Her body had been pushed down by an invisible force. Though she could not make sense of things in her head, Her heart had already fathomed the situation well enough to be pumping gallons of blood through her body. She stood up and walked towards the counter, feeling quite dizzy. By the time she had made her way there, Kozu had returned from the kitchen. "Is she really a ghost?" Fumiko asked Kozu. "Yes," was Kozu's only reply. She had started topping up the sugar pot with sugar. So, this totally impossible thing happened. Fumiko once more began to hypothesize. If the ghost and the curse really happened, then what they say about going back in time might also really be true. Experiencing the curse had convinced Fumiko that you can go back, but there was a problem. It was that rule: in order to go back to the past, you have to sit in one particular seat. Sitting in that one particular seat, however, is a ghost. Anything I say doesn't get through to her, and when I tried to sit there forcefully, she cursed me. What am I meant to do? You just have to wait, Kozu said, as if she could hear Fumiko's thoughts. What do you mean? Every day, there is just one moment when she goes to the toilet. A ghost needs to go to the toilet. While she's gone, you can sit there. Fumiko stared hard into Kozu's eyes. She gave a small nod. That seemed to be the only solution. As to Fumiko's question of whether ghosts go to the toilet, Kozu was unsure of whether it was genuine curiosity or meant for comedic effect, and decided to ignore it with a deadpan expression. Fumiko drew a deep breath. A moment ago she had been grasping at straws. Now she had a piece of straw in her hand, and she wasn't going to let it go. She once had read a story about a man who traded his way up from one piece of straw to become a millionaire. If she was to become a straw millionaire, she mustn't waste that straw. Okay, I'll wait. Fine. But you should know that she doesn't differentiate between day and night. Yes, okay. I'll wait, Fumiko said, desperately clutching her straw. What time do you close? Regular opening hours are until 8 p.m. But if you decide you want to wait, you can wait for as long as it takes. Thank you. Fumiko sat down at the middle of the three tables. She sat with her chair facing the woman in the dress. She folded her arms and breathed hard through her nose. I'm going to get that seat, she announced, glaring at the woman in the dress. The woman in the dress was reading her book, as always. Kozu gave a little sigh. Klangdong hello. Good evening, said Kozu, delivering her standard greeting. Kotake. Standing in the open doorway was a woman. She looked like she might be a little over 40. Kotake was wearing a navy blue cardigan over a nurse's uniform and carrying a plain shoulder bag. Breathing a little heavily, as if she had been running, she held her hand on her chest as if to steady her breath. Thanks for calling, she said. She spoke quickly. Kozu nodded with a smile and disappeared into the kitchen. Kotake took 2 or 3 steps towards the table closest to the entrance and stood next to the man called Fusagi. He didn't seem to notice her at all. Fusagi, Kotake said in a gentle tone that one would normally reserve for a child. At first, Fusagi showed no reaction, as if he hadn't noticed that she had called him. But noticing her in his peripheral vision, he turned to her with a vacant stare. Kotake, he muttered. Yes, it's me, Kotake said with clear articulation. What are you doing here? I had some time off, and I thought I might have a cup of coffee. Oh, okay, Fusagi said. He once more cast his eyes down to his magazine. Kotake, continuing to look at him, sat casually down in the seat opposite. He didn't react to this, and instead turned the page of his magazine. I hear you've been coming here a lot lately, Kotake said, while studying every nook and cranny of the cafe like a customer who was visiting for the first time. Yeah, Fusagi said simply. So you've taken a liking to this place? Oh, not particularly, he said, in a way that clearly showed that he had indeed taken a liking to the place. A slight smile formed on his lips. I'm waiting, he whispered. What are you waiting for? He turned and looked over at the seat where the woman in the dress was sitting. For her to leave that seat, he answered. His face betrayed a boyish glimmer. Fumiko hadn't particularly been eavesdropping, but the cafe was small. What? She exclaimed in surprise at learning that Fusagi was likewise waiting for the woman in the dress to go to the toilet, so he could return to the past. Hearing Fumiko's voice, Kotake turned to look at her. but Fusagi paid no attention to her himself. "Is that so?" Kotake asked. "Yeah," was all that Fusagi said in reply as he took a sip of his coffee. Fumiko was shaken. "Please don't let me have competition. After all," she instantly realized that it was her who was at a disadvantage should they both have the same objective. When she had entered the cafe, Fusagi was already there. Since he was here first, it was his turn first. As a matter of common courtesy, she was not going to jump the queue. The woman in the dress only went to the toilet once a day. Therefore, there was only one chance to sit in the seat each day. Fumiko wanted to go back in time right away. She was unable to bear the thought that she might have to wait an extra day, and was unable to hide her agitation at this unexpected development. She leaned sideways and cocked her ear to make sure that Fusagi really did intend to return to the past. "Did you get to sit there today?" Kotake asked. "Not today." "Oh, you couldn't sit there." "Yeah, no." Their conversation was doing nothing to allay her worst fears. Fumiko scrunched up her face. "Fusagi, what do you want to do when you go back in time?" There was no mistaking. Fusagi was waiting for the woman in the dress to go to the toilet. This revelation was a huge blow for Fumiko. Disappointment spread across her face, and she collapsed onto the table again. The devastating conversation continued. "Something you want to fix?" Well." Fusagi thought for a moment. "That's my secret," he said. He gave a self-satisfied, childish grin. "Your secret?" "Yeah." Even though Fusagi had said it was a secret, Kotake smiled as if something was pleasing. Then she looked over to the woman in the dress. "But it seems like she probably won't be going to the toilet today, does it?" Fumiko hadn't been expecting to hear that. She reacted automatically, lifting her head from the table. Her movement so swift it was almost audible. "Is it possible that the woman might not even go to the toilet?" Kazu said that she goes once a day, but as that woman said, perhaps the woman in the dress has already made today's trip. "No, that can't be the case. I really hope that's not the case." Praying that was not the case, Fumiko waited in trepidation for what Fusagi would say next. "Perhaps that's right," he said, readily conceding this point. "No way." Fumiko's mouth opened as if to let out a shriek, but she was dumbfounded by the shock. Why isn't the woman in the dress going to go to the toilet? What does the woman called Kotake know? She was desperate for answers, yet she sensed that she shouldn't interrupt the conversation. She had always believed that reading the situation was important, and right now, Kotake's entire body language was saying, "Stay out of it." Exactly what she was meant to stay out of was not clear to her, but there was definitely something happening there and outsiders weren't welcome. "So how about we leave?" Kotake said in a gentle, coaxing way. Her big chance was back, setting aside the question of whether the woman in the dress had already gone to the toilet. If Fusagi left, at least she could be rid of her rival. When Kotake had suggested that the woman in the dress probably wouldn't be moving today, Fusagi had simply agreed. "Perhaps that's right." He said perhaps. It is equally plausible that he could have meant, "At any rate, I'm waiting to see." If it was her, Fumiko would definitely wait. She concentrated all of her mental reserves while she waited for his reply, trying not to appear too eager. It was as if her entire body had become her ears. He glanced over at the woman in the dress, then paused, deep in thought. "Sure, okay," he replied. As it was such a clear and simple reply, Fumiko's heart didn't skip a beat. But even so, her excitement soared, and she felt her heart beating fast. "Right then. We'll leave when you finish your cup," said Kotake, looking at the half-empty coffee cup. Fusagi now seemed to be only thinking about leaving. "No, it's okay. It's gone cold anyhow," he said, as he clumsily packed away his magazine, notebook, and pencil, and got up from his seat. Putting on his jacket with fleecy sleeves, a type often worn by construction workers, he made his way to the till. With impeccable timing, Kazu came back out of the kitchen. Fusagi passed her the coffee bill. "What do I owe?" he asked. Kazu entered the amount, using the clunky keys of the ancient cash register. Meanwhile, Fusagi was checking his second bag, his shirt pocket, his back pocket, and every other place he could think. "That's odd, my wallet," he muttered. It seemed he had come to the cafe without his wallet. After looking in the same places again and again, he still couldn't find it. He looked visibly upset, close to tears, even. Then Kotake unexpectedly produced a wallet and held it in front of him. Here, it was a well-worn men's leather wallet folded in half, bulging with what appeared to be a wad of receipts. He paused for a moment, staring at the wallet presented before him. He seemed genuinely in a daze. Finally, he took the wallet offered to him without a word. "How much?" he asked while furrowing into the coin purse as if it was a familiar habit. Kotake said nothing. She simply stood behind Fusagi, watching over him as he went about paying. 380 yen. Fusagi pulled out one coin and handed it to Kozu. "Okay." Receiving 500 yen, Kozu took the money, entered it into the cash register. Churching, she pulled the change from the drawer. "That's 120 yen change." Kozu carefully placed the change and receipt in Fusagi's hand. "Thank you for the coffee," he said, putting the change carefully in his wallet. He stowed the wallet in his bag, having seemingly forgotten that Kotake was there, and he quickly headed for the door. Kwangdong Kotake seemed not in the least bothered by his attitude. "Thank you," she said simply, and followed on after him. Kwangdong, they were rather odd, Fumiko muttered. Kozu cleared the table where Fusagi had sat and disappeared once more into the kitchen. The sudden appearance of a rival had upset Fumiko, but now that only she and the woman in the dress remained, she felt sure that victory would be hers. "Right, the competition's gone. Now I just need to wait for her to vacate the seat," she thought. Yet the cafe had no windows and the 3 wall clocks each showed different times. Without customers coming and going, her sense of time was becoming frozen. Starting to doze off a little, she reeled off the rules for returning to the past. The first rule: the only people one may meet while back in the past are those who have visited the cafe. Fumiko's parting conversation with Goro just happened to have taken place in this cafe. The second rule: no matter how hard one tries while back in the past, one cannot change the present. In other words, even if Fumiko returned to that day 1 week earlier and pleaded for Goro not to go, the fact that he had left for America would not change. She didn't understand why it should be so, and she could feel herself getting upset again thinking about it. But, resigned, she accepted it, given it was the rule. The third rule: in order to return to the past, you have to sit in that seat, and that seat alone. This was the seat occupied by the woman in the dress. If you try to sit there by force, you get cursed. The fourth rule: while back in the past, you must stay in the seat and never move from it. In other words, for some reason or other, you couldn't go to the toilet while back in the past. The fifth rule: there is a time limit. Now that she thought about it, Fumiko still hadn't been told the details of this one. She had no idea how long or short this time was. Fumiko thought about these rules over and over. Her thoughts went back and forth. She went from thinking that going back in time was going to be rather pointless to thinking that she may as well take charge of that conversation and say everything she wanted to after all. It couldn't hurt, could it? If it was not going to change the present. Fumiko went over each rule again and again until finally, slumped on the table, she drifted off to sleep. The first time Fumiko learned of Goro's dream future was when she dragged him out on their third date. Goro was a gaming geek. He loved those massively multiplayer online role-playing games, which he played on a PC. His uncle was one of the developers of a morgue called Arm of Magic, a game that was popular around the world. Ever since he was a boy, Goro had looked up to his uncle. It was Goro's dream to join the game company his uncle ran, TIP-G. To qualify for the selection exam for TIP-G, it was mandatory to have 2 things: at least 5 years experience working as a systems engineer in the medical industry, and to a new and released game program that you had personally developed. Human lives depend on the reliability of systems in the medical industry, and bugs are not tolerated. In the online gaming industry, on the other hand, people put up with bugs as it's possible to apply updates even after the release. To be continued.